we're going to begin tonight. We won't have music because what I've got is going to last probably the whole time. And it's going to be a lot of history. And so we're going to be moving over probably about 150 years worth of history here. And so the question is modern Israel, 1948, is that when it started? So I want to give you a few myths and then a few facts, and we'll then move into some of the history and talk about kind of where we are. But so myth number one, Israel was created in 1948 as compensation for Jewish suffering in the Holocaust, and they were given someone else's land and have been occupying it ever since. That's a myth. Another myth, the Palestinians were a nation before Israel was created in 1948. That's a myth. The third myth, the Jews only started returning to Palestine after World War II in 1948. That's another myth. And then the Jews displaced people living in the land and forced them out. That is a myth. Now, let me give you a few facts. Fact, the Jews are the only existing people ever connected to the land of Israel or Palestine. Israel was a nation there thousands of years before Islam came on the scene or any of the modern nations. Another fact, there have always been Jews living in the land of Palestine. It was never completely vacated of Jews. Another fact, in the 1800s, Jews began to return to Israel in mass. And there are several reasons I'll give you for that. What we see today, the current anti-Semitism, I believe, and I think I can prove this, that it is rooted primarily in spiritual warfare. What we're seeing on college campuses in England, and the United States, and Europe, what we're seeing in the press depicting Israel as a monstrous nation, this oppressive nation, is basically spiritual warfare. You've probably heard the mantra from the river to the sea. That's the modern mantra. River to the sea, Palestine will be free. Basically, they're saying that's a modern invention, depicting the plight of the Palestinian people and their struggle against the Israelis. Really, what that is that's a mantra calling for the destruction of Israel. Because if, from the river to the sea, the river Euphrates all the way to the sea, basically they're saying that all that just needs to go back to, to Islamic Arab peoples, and let's just get rid of the Jews. It's calling for the extermination of the Jews. And so the real issue is from the river to the sea. Where'd that come from? I've talked about this before. It comes out of Exodus, where God gave Israel the land. And in Exodus chapter 23, verse 31, and this will be the only verse I'll go to tonight, and I'm sorry, but there's a lot we're going to talk about. And this is where God says, I will set your bounds from the Red Sea to the sea, that's the Mediterranean Sea, Philistia, and from the desert to the river, that's the Euphrates. For I will deliver the inhabitants of the land into your hands, and you shall drive them out before you. That's God's promise to Israel. I don't know, well over 3,000 years ago that God promised them. And that was his words. And so they've taken God's words and they've adulterized his words and turned it into a call for the destruction of Israel. So most of the opposition is demonic. It's a very unnatural hatred toward Israel. When you look at this and what we're seeing, it really is perplexing. Because there's a lot of conflicts in the world today that people aren't camping out on college campuses about. They're not protesting over. They're not protesting about what's happening in Ukraine. They're not protesting what the Chinese are doing to the Uyghurs and other minorities and to the Christian minority in China. They're not protesting that. They're not protesting what's happening in Congo right now, in Sudan right now, in the Darfur region right now. There's genocides happening, and nobody's even worrying about those kind of things. They're not protesting what Iran's doing through their proxies and their oppression of women and minorities in their country. And so when the whole world is focused on this one small area and the whole world is up in arms about Israel, and all of this stuff they're talking about with the Palestinians, then we need to have an understanding, because the majority of the protesters are completely, hopelessly ignorant of Israel's history and its efforts to make peace in that region. Now, I'm not an apologist for Israel. Israel's made mistakes. There's a war going on right now, and many of you know, you've been in combat or you served in the military, you know that things happen in war, terrible things happen in war. A lot of innocent people have been killed. You can fault Hamas mostly for that, when they park their missiles, in schoolyards, and they put their fighters, in UN compounds and in hospitals. And when Israel drops a little knock bomb on top of a apartment complex, say, hey, get out. And they call the apartment complex and say, we are going to bomb this. And Hamas says, bomb it. We don't care. Because they don't care about their people. Because for them, the more civilians that die, that's better for their narrative. And so Hamas could care less about people dying. Israel is the only one there that seems to care about death tolls. Because they know that the world is looking at them, the world in many ways hates them, and they understand the pressure that's on them. And so they seem to be the only one concerned about the life of innocent people right now. But before we look at the context of today, let's talk about the history. Let's talk about the kind of the deeper story here. So let's go with the basics. So Palestine, the name Palestine, where does that come from? Well, it's kind of an insult is what it is. So that name comes from the Romans. So in 137, there was the Bar Kokhba revolt. This Jewish general led a revolt against the Romans. And the Romans, almost were defeated, but they finally defeated the Jewish forces, and they said, we're done with this. Now, they had, in 70 AD, they had destroyed Jerusalem, and now they're going to destroy the rest of it. And so they destroy all these cities and towns, and they exile all these Jewish people. They go to all these different places. They go to Yemen. They go to what we call Iraq, would be Babylonia. They go into Iran. They go into the Turkish regions. They go up into Europe. A lot of them are sold into slavery. A lot of them are murdered by the Romans, and they pretty much evacuate the land of Judea. Not all the Jews leave, but most of them leave, and they go into exile. And so the Romans are like, well, let's just change the name. Well, what can we call it? Well, they call it Palestinia because that word is translated in the Greek, the land of the Philistines. And so they wanted to go back to, well, let's just call it what it used to be called, the land of the Philistines, so let's call it that. And so that's what that word means. It's a Roman word. And so that word kind of died out when the Roman Empire fell. And so, that whole area has been ruled by a number of empires. And so that name kind of fell out of favor, especially with the Ottomans who ruled it for several hundred years. And the word Palestinian didn't kind of really come back into vogue until the British kind of brought it back. When they were in charge of trying to figure out this whole thing back in the early 1900s and the mid 1920s and 30s and 40s. And so they kind of brought that word back. And it wasn't until 1964 that word became associated with a religious political group, which was the PLO, Palestine Liberation Organization. It was Yasser Arafat who really utilized that word and made it identify with a group of people. The word Palestine or Palestinian was really kind of a dead word until England brought it back, and then that region became known as Palestine. But if you lived there, if you were a Christian, there were a lot of Christians living there. If you were Jewish, and there were about 10% of the population was Jewish, or if you were an Arab, they were all called Palestinians. In fact, Golda Meir, who was a prime minister in England or in Israel, she said, I was a Palestinian. From 1921 to 1948, I had a Palestinian passport. We were all Palestinians. She says, there's just no such thing as a Palestinian person. So that was just the area that we lived in, and everybody was called Palestinians. And so the name Palestine or Palestinian is a creation by the Romans. So the region, and I'm going to refer to this region as Palestine because that's what it's called right now. So the region is between the Mediterranean Sea and the Iraqi border. And that whole region there has been ruled by a number of empires of the last 3,000 years. The Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Greeks, the Hasmoneans, the Romans, the Arab Muslims, the Christians, the Ottomans, who they pretty much kept it the longest, and then the British had it. And so it has never been home to any nation of people except for one, the Jews. It's the only nation ever associated with that land that we call Palestine right now, which we're looking at basically that sliver of land. And so if you look at the map of the Middle East today, that didn't exist before 1940. Some of you are older than most of the nations in that region. I mean, all the nations we think about, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, they didn't exist. All those little nations, the UAE, Oman, all that, none of that existed. It was just open, barren land with a few population centers and a few people who kind of lived in agricultural areas, and that was it. And it was all ruled by the Ottoman Empire. And so when we look at this picture of the Middle East, let's kind of look at the pre-World War I, because World War I is really when things began to progress. But before World War I, the land again was dominated by the Ottoman Empire. That's the Turkish people. And England ruled over Egypt. So they had the Sinai, they had the Suez Canal, and they had Egypt. It was not a colony, it was a protectorate. The colonies they had were like Australia, New Zealand, India, but they kept Egypt as a protectorate to kind of keep the French, happy, because the French built the Suez Canal, and then England kind of took over that region and made the French mad. They were always at war over things, and so that was kind of their way to kind of keep the French happy. But they ruled over that, until 1954. England had it as a protectorate. The rest was all the Ottoman Empire. So just put out of your mind, all the things, like Iran didn't exist. So the French had some areas they controlled, the Germans had some areas they controlled, and the Russians had a little bit of area they controlled in that whole region. And so we think about what happened before World War I. It was just a mostly unpopulated, undeveloped area. In fact, a lot of the land was seen as just, unproductive desert and swamp until the Jews started coming back, and that changed. And so the people of Palestine before World War I was mostly dominated by tribes and factions of tribes and various sects of Islam, and then there were some regions where there were Christians, and there were some Jews sprinkled here and there throughout the region. A lot of them were in Jerusalem, some of the little towns around Jerusalem. Most of the Christians lived in the Lebanese area, in Lebanon. That is until they invited a group of Palestinians to come up who were refugees to come and be a part of their land, and they came in. Basically, they tried to take over, and they started kicking all the Christians out, and so Lebanon's been a mess ever since that happened. But back to pre-World War I, the population of this Palestinian area for Jewish people was about 10%. And again, none of the nations we know of today, none of that existed. Jordan, Saudi Arabia, none of that existed. It was just groups of people that existed there. So in the 1800s, there began to be this push for a Jewish homeland. And it happened in Europe, specifically in England, and in the Americas. There were two things that really happened. One was the reestablishment of the Hebrew language. Hebrew language was dead. And then this young kid in Europe who was a linguistic prodigy began to study the Hebrew language, and he became this scholar that basically brought Hebrew back from the dead. And he taught people how to speak it. He actually went to the land of Palestine and met the Jewish people there, and they taught him a lot of stuff. And if you go to Israel today, you will see a statue of him. He is the one who basically brought the language of Hebrew back to life that had been dead for almost 2,000 years. Because, all those people have been scattered all over the place. They've been in Russia, they've been in the Caucasus, they've been in European areas, they've been in some of the Middle East areas, and they'd lost their language. It's almost like the Tower of Babel happened a second time for the Israeli people, the Jewish people. And then the language was reborn. Then something else happened in France in the late 1800s called the Dreyfus Affair, which this Jewish officer in the French army was accused of something, and he was convicted, and it caused a massive upheaval because he was totally innocent. Everybody knew he was innocent, but because he was Jewish, he was blamed. This lasted from like 1894 to 1906, and it was horrible. It split the country, and so finally the guy was exonerated, but the Jews looked at this whole Dreyfus Affair and said, we've got to leave Europe, because anti-Semitism was just growing. It was becoming really, really bad. And so you see this thing called the Zionist movement begin to happen. And a lot of that was coming out of the Jewish quarters, but also there were a lot of Christian Zionists who believed it was their duty as Christians to help the Jews go back to their homeland and to reestablish their nation. A lot of that came out of their eschatology, that they believed that if Israel was resurrected, that would bring the Messiah back. And so they believed it was their duty, their Christian duty, to do that. And so they really began to work and push this. And so World War I happens, and of course, the Ottomans and Germany, they lose the war. And so all of a sudden, you've got this land that had no freedom. The Ottomans ruled it with an iron fist. There was no freedom of speech, no freedom of religion, no freedom of assembly, but now it's a free area. And you have something that happens just after the war. It's the establishment of the League of Nations. And part of the establishment of the League of Nations was that they thought, okay, we need to do a two-state solution. We keep hearing about that. It started all the way back with the League of Nations. We need to have a two-state solution in this region. We'll have an area for the Arabs and an area for the Jews, and we'll have these two states. And so in 1970, there was the Balfour Declaration. And so Albert Balfour was the British Foreign Secretary, and he wrote this little handwritten note, basically a declaration saying that the king wants there to be a state of Israel in the Palestinian area. And we're going to work to do this, and we're going to do it in such a way it will not disenfranchise any of the non-Jews in that region. It'll be a place where these people can live, and they can have their homeland. And the Balfour Declaration was a very important statement. And it kind of got the ball rolling in an official way. And so England was then tasked by the League of Nations to do this. And it was called the British Mandate, which basically it was their obligation to repatriate Jews to the land of Palestine and create this nation. And the area was massive. And so all of the Jordanian area, all the area that Israel is in now, was going to be this place for these two groups of people to live in. And it was huge. It was easy enough for these two groups to live in this region. And so that's what the League of Nations came up with. They tasked the English with doing this. And so they said, we're going to do this. And so the Jewish Zionists began to buy massive tracts of land. Now this is important, because when people say that the Jews force people off their land, that is a lie, an absolute lie. First of all, the Jews came in, and they were funded from America and from England and from Europe, and the Zionist organizations began to go in and purchase at exorbitant prices because the Arabs began to jack the prices up because they're like, man, these people want to come buy this worthless land. Let's really sell it to them. And they did. They started selling it to them. And so it was swamps and arid land. And they're like, nothing will grow here. These people are crazy to come live in this land. And so they started buying all this land. The problem is the Jews came from Europe. And they were educated. They brought their technology with them. They understood agriculture. And they began to work the land. And they began to build an agricultural society. And that would create problems. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. And so you start seeing this immigration beginning to happen between the two world wars, and England's trying to manage this, and so you've got this British Mandate going on, and so you've got all this land that's there, and the problems start pretty much immediately. And so the Arabs they start seeing all these Jews coming in, and the Jews are starting to work the land, and the land is starting to flourish. And they get jealous. It's like, wait a second, we didn't know the land could do this, and now all of a sudden there's agriculture, and they're angry about this. They feel like, they were somehow tricked, that the Jews did some kind of trickery on them, whatever, to get their land from them, although they purchased it, at exorbitant prices. And so there begins to be problems, and the Arabs begin to revolt. And so the English are trying to figure this whole thing out, and they're trying to play both sides against each other here, and how do we keep the peace? And there's all this stuff going on. And so the colonial governor of the region comes up with a plan. His name was Winston Churchill. And his plan was, we'll just take everything to the east of the Jordan and we'll give it to the Arabs, and we'll say that no Jews can live there. And they declared the Emirate of the Transjordan. Today it's called Jordan, but they created this emirate, so to speak. And they even declared there was going to be a king. And so, England was pretty good about making kings out of people who weren't kings. And so they said to Abdullah, you're going to be the king of the Transjordan Emirate. And so he became the king. And so now this reduces the size of the land that Israel can exist on. And so you start seeing all this compression, and the Arabs are getting more and more angry because more Jews are coming, and they're mad about this. And all this is under the auspices of the League of Nations. And the Jewish people are purchasing the land. Nobody's stealing land. Nobody's pushing people off their land. None of that's happening, but the Arabs are getting angry about this. It's just a bad situation. And England doesn't know what to do with this. Now, let's just talk about the League of Nations. So they had this British mandate, and so the League of Nations goes away. And then in 1945, there's another organization called the United Nations that gets created. Well, part of their charter was that any of the former League of Nations terms that were still in force, that were not repealed, they would assume those. Well, the British mandate was never repealed. And so the United Nations basically takes over this British mandate in 1945, and they're like, we're going to create a two-state solution. And so, they start working on that. But we'll get to that in just a little bit. So in the 1920s and 1930s, open immigration is happening. I mean, Jews are coming there under the promise of freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and this is even promised to the Arabs who are living there. Now, again, nobody is called a Palestinian in terms of people who are non-Jew. They're all Palestinian, but they call themselves Arabs, or they call themselves Christians, or they call themselves Jews, and Palestinian as terms of the region that they were in. And so from 1919 to 1923, 4 years, 35,000 Jews immigrated to the British Mandate area as Britain's trying to figure all this out. And they've carved the land up, and there's all these different maps and everything. And so the Jewish International organizations are still buying land, and the land is really flourishing, and the Arabs are getting more and more angry about this. And in 1920, the terrorist attacks begin. The first one happens in Jerusalem in April of 1920, where the Arabs attack the Jews. They're in that area. And so there's this revolt that happens. This jihad is declared, and it's called the Nebi Musa Jihad. And it's and so the Arabs are called to resist the Jews, to try to push them out. They don't want them in this area, because they're starting to see this is a desirable area, and now we want it back. We don't care if they bought the land. We want this back now. And so there's all this infighting happening. There's even infighting between the Jewish groups, because you got some Jews who came from Russia, and they understood Marxism pretty well. There's groups that came from Europe, and they understood democracy and even kingships and things like that. And so they start having infighting as well. And so England is caught in the middle of all of this, and they don't want to be in this. They're just trying to find peace. In 1930, the total population of that area was 1 million people. This is this massive area, 1 million people. That's it. And again, 10% at the time were Jews. In 1931, Jews made up 17% of the population. 1936, they made up 26%. You can see there's just a massive growth of Jewish people coming to this area. And the Arabs continue to revolt. There continue to be terrorist attacks going on, and it's called the Great Revolt now. The Jewish population is growing. The attacks also increase. In 1937, England declares martial law. They send in 100,000 troops, more troops than they had even in India, to put down the revolt. And so the British administrators, they come up with this great idea. Let's bring in one central Islamic figure who was a moderate, and he can kind of come in and kind of negotiate this and kind of calm down the crowd, and this will be really good. And so they bring in a guy by the name of Hajj Amin al-Husseini, or the Grand Mufti. And so he was to be the leader of the Islamic movement in Jerusalem, and the British saw him as a moderate. This guy's going to be great. Here's the problem. As soon as he is installed in Jerusalem, he quickly pivots to incite violence against the Jews. He starts declaring the Jews want to come in and destroy the Dome of the Rock, the Mosque of Omar on top of the Temple Mount. They want to build a third temple there. In 1933, he's beginning to meet with this group called the Nazis, who were trying to, they're in this whole region as well. In a lot of ways, they're actually looking for religious relics and artifacts. I know there's a movie like this, but that is true. They were obsessed with this, and so he begins to interface with the Nazis, and he begins to encourage them, look, you need to start spreading this fascism thing more. This is a good thing, fascism. And of course, in 1937, the British uncover his plot to overthrow them, and they try to arrest him, and he flees to Lebanon. And then in 1941, Adolf Hitler invites him to come to Nazi Germany as his guest. And so he goes there, and so Hitler sets him up with a well-funded radio broadcast network where he can broadcast back into the Muslim areas with all this anti-Semitism and how that all these people ought to rally to the Nazis. And so he begins to, over shortwave, he begins to broadcast. And his broadcasts are vile. They are horrible. He says things like, kill the Jews where you find them. This will help you find grace in the eyes of God. And this guy, he was a horrible, horrible person. And Hitler loved him. Now, Benjamin Netanyahu makes the claim this guy is the one who convinced Hitler to come up with the final solution of exterminating the Jews. There's really no historical evidence for that, but that's what Netanyahu says. However, in the Nuremberg trials after World War II, Adolf Eichmann's deputy blamed the Grand Mufti for fomenting and encouraging the extermination efforts against the Jews. And so he certainly was doing this. And a lot of what we see today is a part of his handiwork, because he instilled in the hearts of a lot of these people that Jews they're subhuman, that they need to be destroyed, they're the scourge of the earth, they control all the banks, they control everything, they're the leaders of the world, and they're horrible people. A lot of this that we see, the vitriol in the Middle East, comes right from him. So after World War II, he's arrested by France, but he escapes, goes to Egypt, and he stays there, fomenting all of his hatred until he dies in 1974. But again, his efforts in the 1930s and 1940s still live on today. And so when we look back at the 1930s, it was a weird time, because England, again, they're in the middle of all this, and they don't want to be in the middle of all this. They realize, okay, we're in something we don't know how to control. And so there comes a point where they just stop. This is right before the breakout of World War II. They stop any repatriation of the Jews into this land. They stop the immigration process. They effectively close the door to Jewish immigration right when the extermination efforts are beginning to really ramp up in Europe. And so, the British, they're trying to figure all this stuff out. They've got something called the Peel Commission that again, they recommend a two-state solution, and there'll be a small enclave for the Jews on the seacoast. It will represent only 20%, of the original, mandate. And the Arabs get 80%, and the Jews were like, we'll take it. Whatever you give us, we'll take it. Now you'll see, this is the pattern we see with Israel, with the Jews. Every time they've been offered land, they're like, we'll take it. It's not a good deal, but we'll take it. And every time that the Palestinian Arabs have been offered to make peace, they've always said no. They've always rejected. We see that, those two things happening, throughout history. And so World War II breaks out. There's almost no immigration that's taking place during World War II. And then after World War II, the United Nations created in 1945. They immediately endorsed the two-state solution, and they said, we got to make this happen. We've got to solve this problem. And so Britain is like the rat caught in the trap, and they're like, we've had enough of this cheese, so we're out of this. And so we're going to give up the British mandate and let somebody else take this on. And so they walk away from the mandate, and they're like, United Nations, you can handle this. And so the UN, the Special Commission on Palestine, that recommend this two-state solution, it passes by 7-3, and so they begin to work on this. And so they work on this, and again, they come up with this land, plan that's all cut up and weird looking, and the Jews aren't happy with it, but they're like, we'll take it. And the Arabs aren't happy with it, and they said, we reject this out of hand. No Jews can live in this area. And their response was, any partition of the land will be met with rivers of blood. So on May 14th, yesterday was the anniversary, Israel became a nation, 1948. That's the Jewish Independence Day. And the Arabs call that day Nakba Day, or the catastrophe. That's what they call it. And so on this date, May 15th, the Arab nations declared war on Israel. And 5 nations, with some other minor players like Morocco, they invade. And they're like, we're going to get rid of this, this bunch of Jews. And so on May 15th, 1948, Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq invade. And they're just going to wipe them out. The Arab leaders vowed there will be a war. This will be a war of extermination as momentous as the massacres from the Crusades. And so their goal was not the liberation of the Palestinian oppressed people, but the extermination of the Jews. And their plan was, once we exterminate these people, we wipe them out, we'll divide the land between the 5 nations, and it'll be ours. And it's a land grab is basically what it is. And so they see these 5 nations that have just kind of recently been created, they're like, hey, this is a great way for us to kind of expand our empire, so to speak. This is basically, it's an attempt to, let's just kill the baby in the crib. We don't need to let Israel grow up. We got to get rid of it at the start. So after 9 months of fighting, Israel wins, a decisive victory. And so in 1949, there's an armistice that's signed. Israel's territory has now expanded by 40%. The result is you have 650,000 Arab Palestinian refugees. And like I said, some of those people went into Jordan, some of them went into Lebanon, and they almost destroyed Lebanon, and the Christian groups that welcomed them, there was almost no Christians there because the Palestinians tried to wipe them out. And the Jordanians who welcomed them in to their area, it was a disaster. There came a point to where the Jordanians just finally said enough, and their army pushed them back out of Jordan because they were trying to overthrow the king. I mean, this is why no nation today is accepting Palestinian refugees. Nobody wants them. So before the Gulf War, just a little bit of history, before the Gulf War, the Emir of Kuwait allowed 350,000 Palestinian refugees to come to Kuwait to live. And guess what they did? They sided with a guy by the name of Saddam Hussein. They wanted to overthrow the guy who brought them there because they thought he's too westernized, and we need to have this guy, Saddam Hussein, come in and just wipe out Kuwait. And of course, after the Gulf War, when Kuwait was reestablished, what does the Emir of Kuwait do? He kicks them out. He says, you got to go back to where you were. He expels them because they sided with his enemy. Egypt's the same way. Egypt doesn't want them. You know, you look at Gaza right now, it's 26 miles long, 5 miles across. And people call it an apartheid state. They say it's this oppressed place by Israel because Israel has a blockade. Here's the problem. At the southern end of that is a border with Egypt. And Egypt has said they're not coming in here. Why? Because they know this group will come in and try to overthrow the Egyptian government. Because it's what they seem to do. And so none of the nations around there want them because there's so much hatred and vitriol that they have for everybody. It's like they're just against everyone, but especially Israel. So 1949, Israel lost 1% of their population in the war. Jordan's king, he sent his armies in. They occupied the West Bank. This is ours. Egypt took over the Gaza Strip, and they said, this is ours. Here's the problem. So they have these two areas, which they still have these two areas today. Jordan didn't make these people citizens. Egypt didn't make these people citizens. They basically occupied these lands, and nobody talked about their occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. Nobody talked about what they were doing. None of the Arab nations revolted. It's only Israel that seems to be the occupying land that people get upset about. And so as a result of this war, in the surrounding Arab lands, there were a lot of Jews. I remember going to Iran back in the late 90s and talking to this guy he's like, yeah, we've got Jews who live here. They don't live there anymore. There was a synagogue in the city of Isfahan. He said, oh yeah, it's an ancient synagogue, And so after the war, 260,000 Jews left Yemen, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, Syria, and they all moved to the land of Israel. That's where they moved to. And so 1949, 48 was, it was just this weird time where the Arabs tried to eliminate Israel, and Israel actually ended up defeating them. And then Israel turns around and says, look, we want peace. Let's have the two-state solution. Again, this is the pattern Israel has. Whenever they get attacked, they usually take over the land, and then they come back and say, okay, let's trade land for peace. And of course, they do that with, eventually with Jordan and with Egypt, and they form peace treaties with them, and they trade the land back. After I guess it was the 73 war, where Ariel Sharon, the bulldozer, he goes in, he takes over the Sinai Peninsula, and they push all the Egyptians back, and Israel takes over the Sinai, and then Israel comes back into Egypt and says, look, let's negotiate. We'll give you back the Sinai. Let's sign a peace treaty. And of course, there's a peace treaty signed with Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin. Of course, Sadat gets assassinated because of this. And so we always see Israel trying, all they want is peace. They don't want to occupy these lands. They don't want their people in these areas. They don't want to manage these areas. They just want to live in peace. So you've got several wars, the 1967 war, where Israel's attacked. And of course, Israel wins. They take the Golan, they take the Sinai. And the response by the Arabs when Israel says, let's have a peace treaty. Let's form a peace. So the response from the Arab League, as they met in Khartoum, Sudan, was to basically give the famous 3 no's of Khartoum, which was no peace with Israel, no negotiations ever with Israel, and no recognition of Israel. That's what they said. After Israel offered to make peace with them and to give land back, this was their response. No peace, no negotiation, no recognition. Then you have the Yom Kippur War, as I mentioned. Of course, Israel lost thousands of soldiers, and of course, they eventually would take the Golan Heights, and they would take the Sinai, and then Israel they would exchange land for peace with Egypt and Jordan. And then you move into the 1980s and 1990s. We see all these efforts by the United States trying to broker a peace deal. We come to the 2000 Camp David Accords, and it seems like we've got it. I mean, Bill Clinton is excited because he's got, the 2 leaders of, the Palestinians and the Israelis there, and they're going to find a 2-state solution that's going to be really good. And And it's an awesome deal for the Palestinians. It's not a great deal for Israel. Israel's like, we'll take it. Because, it would have basically established a Palestinian state. East Jerusalem would be the capital of the Palestinian state. And Yasser Arafat walked out and said no. They gave him everything he wanted, and he still turned it down. Because he didn't want peace. He wanted Israel gone. And so he goes back, and he instantly launches the second Intifada, which results in all kinds of terrorist bombings in cafes and buses and attacks on civilians. Several thousand Israelis are murdered. And who gets blamed for this? Israel. The press, lambast Israel as a source of evil in the Middle East. They're portrayed as an aggressive country, that's just, oppressing innocent people that just want peace. And it just sounds like what's going on today. And this Intifada lasted for 3 years. And Israel began to severely curtail the movement of Palestinians in the Israeli area. So we were in Israel. What year did we go to Israel? 98. And there were all kind of Palestinians. Our bus driver was Palestinian. Our guide was a Palestinian. We were in Palestinian areas, and they were working in shops. And there was relative peace there until the Intifada was declared. And you got people putting bombs on buses. You got the Sbarro pizza, parlor that is bombed there, and a bunch of people are killed. You got people being gunned down in the streets. And Israel said enough. And so they start pushing back the Palestinians out of that area. They start trying to curtail this, and they start trying to find a way to let these people come in and to work. But, demand is this, the whole thing. And finally, we get to the year 2005, and Ariel Sharon, the bulldozer, he's like, look, we're done with trying to manage Gaza and try to manage the West Bank, and he pulls all their troops out. And he says, we're going to pull all the settlers out of the Gaza area. 10,000 settlers are forcibly moved by the IDF out of that area. It was horrible. A lot of strife. And so they uproot all these people. They bring them, they're like, Gaza, Palestinians, you can have it. They leave an intact industry, a flour industry, worth billions of dollars. For the Palestinians to go in, and they could have taken over that, and they could have made all kinds of money. What do? They burned it down. They burned it down because the Israelis gave it to them. They didn't want it. We don't want this. We don't want anything from the Jews. So we get to 2007, and there's elections in Gaza. And the elections are between Fatah and Hamas wins. Well, Hamas starts trying to eliminate, their opponents. And so what's called the Battle of Gaza breaks out, and it's a civil war. And they are killing hundreds and hundreds and thousands of Palestinians. The Palestinians are doing this. This is Hamas. And Hamas is a brutal, horrible organization that has only one purpose: to destroy and eliminate Israel. That's all they're there for. They're not there to help their people. People talk about, Israel having a blockade. Well, it's not a very good blockade because, October 7th, Hamas launched thousands of rockets. How'd they get those rockets through that blockade? Well, they smuggled it in. This is humanitarian aid. And they found ways around it. They weren't smuggling in food and medicine. They didn't care about their people. That's why they put missiles, in schoolyards. And that's why they put their fighters, in apartment complexes and in hospitals and things like that. Because they don't care about their people. They never have. That's why in the West Bank, Hamas is outlawed. Because the Palestinian Authority over there, or Fatah, they don't want these people there. That's why they won't hold an election, because they know Mahmoud Abbas, who's the president of that, or prime minister, whatever he is, he won't hold an election because he knows he will lose and Hamas will take over. And then you'll have another really radical terrorist state on the other side of Israel. And so he doesn't want that. And so, in 2008, Barack Obama says, we're going to solve this problem. And so he suggests a two-state solution. and Israel's going to go back to the pre-1967 borders, and there'll be land swaps, there'll be no more settlements, and Prime Minister Ehud Olmert says, we'll do it. We'll do it. We'll take it. Everything the Palestinians wanted, they offered. They gave them everything they wanted. They would divide Jerusalem. The capital for Palestine could be there. And so Olmert gave Abbas a detailed map of how this would all be laid out. Abbas took it, went back to his office, and never returned. He never called. He just said whatever. And so that was the last time the Jewish and Palestinian leaders actually met, was in 2008. And so today you have basically two quasi-Palestinian states, Gaza, led by Hamas, and the West Bank, led by Fatah. Both of them hate Israel. They want Israel gone. They want Israel destroyed. And it's a horrible, terrible situation. And so the takeaways from all of this, I'm going to give you 10 takeaways. Number one, there have always been Jews living in the region of Judea or Palestine. Always. It's never been completely bereft of Jews. Number two, Israel was legitimately founded in good faith by the League of Nations and the UN. The world body came and established Israel. Number three, there has never been a Palestinian state or national group of people called Palestinians. Never. Number four, the current people called Palestinians have a history of terrorism and rejecting Israel's offers of land for peace and their rejection of the two-state solution. Number five, these two mutually hostile Palestinian areas hate each other and they hate Israel. Number six, there's only one nation that has any historical claim and ties to the land, and that's Israel. It's the only nation. Number seven, Israel has acquired land through legal purchases, the declaration of world bodies, and when attacked by hostile nations and terrorist groups or coalitions of nations, that they've always responded after, they've taken over the land of we'll give the land back for peace. And so number eight, Israel's always been willing to have a land swap for peace and accept all peace deals that were brokered. And the Palestinians have rejected every single one of them. Number nine, the Palestinians reject the peace offers because they want the full destruction of Israel. That's their objective. They don't want any Jews in the area. They want them gone. And number 10, the current movement of hatred in the Western world is a spiritual movement more than a political or a humanitarian movement. And that's where we are today. Israel was not a nation for almost 2,000 years, and the language came back to life. And then the hearts of people began to be stirred of there needs to be a nation. And people began to be drawn back to that land. And world bodies began to try to make this happen. And bookend that with 2 world wars, and then after that, all these other wars against Israel. Israel should never, ever, ever have existed. Ever. It should have been wiped out. It should never have even happened, but it did. And so we have to ask, how is that possible? What is the force that's driving this? Just sheer human will? No. I mean, for the Christian, we have to look at this through our lens and say, this is God, through His plan, bringing these people back to a land that He gave to Abraham and his descendants years ago, and God has continued to keep His promise to these people. And so, there, you can disagree with Israel's methods, and again, this is not a perfect nation, and there are things they've done that, just like any nation that's been at war that, is probably terrible, but it is a civilized nation, and it is a nation that has tried to pursue peace and tried to find peace. And I mean, they have, at every turn when there have been peace offers, they've taken it. The Abraham Accords. We had the Abraham Accords with, Donald Trump. And it seems like this is going to be awesome. And we've got Saudi Arabia, and we've got, all these other nations coming along and say, we will make peace with Israel. And then it's like we're walking that back now. And the nation that's fomenting the most hatred over there, Iran, we're giving them money. It doesn't make any sense. I don't understand any of that until I look at it through the lens of the spiritual. And this is not just dusty old history. We are alive at a time when God is at work in our world, and massive spiritual tectonic plates are moving. And who knows what's going to happen next? Who knows where all this is going? But we have a ringside seat. And as Christians, we take comfort in the fact that the Lord is in control, and His plan will unfold as it should. So we have about 10 minutes left. Now, I covered 130 years, 140 years, and I left a lot out, a lot. Okay, there's a lot of things that, could be said and talked about, a lot of history there. But if you got maybe a question, I will do my best. I see your hand.
1948,
Yeah.
Was it 90-day war or 9 months?
9 months. The Arabs thought they would just, they thought like Vladimir Putin did. He'll just go in and just wipe out Ukraine in 2 or 3 days. That's what they thought. We got 5 armies, plus some of the African nations are going to send some troops as well. And and they, for all intents and purposes, they should have wiped them out. But for some reason, Israel prevailed. So, other questions? All right. Well, I hope this has been informative. Oh, Barry? Well, most like your students today, the student movements, are made of people who have no idea of what reality is. They have, they've kind of glommed on to, something that's popular, and they've not educated themselves. And it's sad to see ignorant people, but these are, the ignorant armies that are out there, just marching to some drumbeat, and they don't even know what drumbeat they're marching to. So, just a little bit of historical context goes a long way. So,
unfair question. Do you see an end to this?
Oh yeah, there's an end to this. It's just read that last book. There's an end to this. But in terms of our modern world, we have a nation that's not going anywhere, and there's an intractable enemy that they're not ready to just say, okay, we're going to give up. We'll take the 2-state solution. They don't want a 2-state solution. They want a 1-state solution. That's all they want, and they want the wholesale destruction of Israel and Jews. And the hatred, it's so unnatural. Again, this one group of people, this one little sliver of land, and it's like all the eyes of the world are just focused on that, and all the hatred and vitriol, is focused on Israel. And there are places on this planet that are just, you've got people who are just butchers that are doing horrible, terrible things to people. It's like nobody cares about that. It's like, Israel. Israel has no right to exist. Israel's an oppressor. Israel's this, this juggernaut that's just, keeping these people, from living good lives. And it's just not the case. They've always wanted a 2-state solution. They've always wanted, the Arab Palestinians to have their own land, determine their own destiny. They've always wanted that. Okay. All right. Well, if you want any of these notes, I'm happy to give them to you. So just let me know, and I'll print them out or email them to you. And And hey, there's a lot of resources on this. There really are. There's a lot of great resources. There's videos on this. There's all kind of books on this. There's a lot of good stuff out there that just gives you the facts of history. And, we don't want to gloss over, terrible things. We don't want to paint Israel as something that it's not, but we don't want to paint them as something that, is terrible when they're not terrible either. So there's got to be, history has to be about truth. And that's what has been lost today is truth. We've lost it, and common sense as well. All right, we'll pray and we'll be dismissed. Lord, we give you praise for your plan, for our lives and for this world. And Lord, we do pray for the peace of Jerusalem. We pray, Lord, that we would see peace in that region. None of us want to see anybody, any civilians, anyone in combat die. We don't want to see carnage and bloodshed. We want to see peace. But Lord, we also have to understand there's a spiritual war going on, and so much of what is happening has a spiritual backdrop. And that is what so much of this is hanging on, is the spiritual. And I pray we will be wise to that. We will understand that. We will not be discouraged as we see what's happening in the physical world, because we know that in the spiritual world, you're the conqueror. You're in charge, and your will be done. So Lord, we pray for that. We pray that your will would be done in our world and in our lives. And we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, God bless you. Have a good night, and we'll look forward to seeing you on the Lord's day.